Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Decloak podcast. Today's episode is actually going to be our Christmas special. We wanted to raise awareness around things like cyber fraud and scams that may trip up people during the festive period, and who better to speak with than our friends at the Cyber Helpline. Previously, we had Bruce Keebo on to discuss all the good work that Cyber Helpline do and all the pitfalls around various different online scams. So we wanted to get someone else from the Cyber Helpline onto the podcast. So today we have Charlotte Hooper, who is the head of operations at the Cyber Hotline and also co-chair of the Global Online Harms Alliance. And yes, hi, Charlotte, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again. And for everyone's reference, this is our second attempt. We had an Amazon driver accosted me at the window. So here we go. We're here. We're finally recording. So yeah, we'll jump right in. And yeah, Charlotte, if you could give us a brief overview of you and who you are in your career. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So, um, of course, I'm now head of operations at the Cyber Helpline, but it's been a interesting journey for me to get here, and it's certainly not where I thought I'd end up being. So my background is I was kind of home educated from the age of 13. Wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life and ended up in the beauty industry, specifically skincare for quite a few years. Until I thought I need to do something. I ended up studying undergraduate in policing and criminal justice, which is where I came across the Cyber Helpline. As we had to do a placement year. So I volunteered with the Cyber Helpline for a year when it was in its very early days. I think there were only 3 or 4 of us at the time. And it was really, really interesting because a lot of my kind of friends and other people at uni had got like work experience with like the council and the probation service. And I remember my family being like, oh, I wish you could have got something like that. And yeah, now I am where I am. I think it was meant to happen, and it's been incredible. So yeah, I mean, I always wanted to end up kind of in some sort of forensic capacity. Forensic genealogy was my interest, very different to cyber. But as I've kind of gone into the Cyber Helpline and been here for nearly 6 years now, I think. I began studying more towards cybercrime. I did my master's in cybercrime investigation. I think I finished that a year ago now. And yeah, it's been an incredible journey. And like I said, definitely not where I thought I'd be, but very happy to be here in the world of cyber.
Nice. I think it's always, I don't think anyone's ever had a traditional route into cyber.
No.
And I think that's testament to the type of industry that we have. And I hope that it becomes more and more diverse with people that maybe don't want to follow that kind of conventional path and then kind of moving in. And obviously, you'd mentioned your master's, and, what was the kind of key elements of that you'd learned, and, how do you use that in your everyday work if you do use it? That is, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm interviewing people every day, or was at the time, who wanted to join the Cyber Helpline, and I'm talking about what careers they want to get into. And I mean, I didn't even do an IT GCSE, so I was like, so I kind of felt like, I've learned a lot from the Cyber Helpline. I wanted to, prove that I know what I'm talking about. And I guess B, like, I wanted to adapt that knowledge and really just kind of learn more. And I think cybercrime investigation was really interesting. I didn't want to go down the route of, traditional kind of a cybersecurity master's. And I thought that kind of cybercrime investigation was a master's that was being offered and ideal for me because I'm not a super technical person. But I learned some pretty cool stuff. We did some modules around open source intelligence, which has always been a massive interest of mine, even back when I was looking into forensic genealogy, as well as kind of bits around digital forensics and things like that, which has really kind of supported me in understanding, the limitations of some of the things that law enforcement, etc., are able to do.
Nice. And then, talk me through some of the challenges you've faced within the industry. Obviously, you were relatively new into it. You can go in depth as you like. It can be professional, it can be personal. And again, kind of talk me through what was those challenges and also the kind of drivers for joining the hotline.
Yeah, so I think the first kind of the natural one that comes to me is one of the drivers that got me into the helpline, but also a massive challenge in my life. So I guess I was in my second year of university when, and ironically, I'd already started at the Cyber Helpline, but I'd just found out that I'd been being stalked for the last 5 years.
Wow.
And it was very an interesting experience because it was all very covert. I didn't know it was happening until someone messaged me and was like, hey, this guy's posting photos of you onto like porn websites essentially.
Wow. Yeah.
And they were just, normal selfies and things that I'd taken. 15-year-old posting on Instagram.
Yeah.
And he was posting onto Reddit, porn sites, etc. But also just messaging me constantly every day, which I knew of, but thought, this is a bit weird. Never had met the guy, and it was a really weird experience where I was lucky that I'd just joined the helpline. I knew about, some of the challenges the police face, and I kind of knew what to expect. But during that time, the experience I had with the police was interesting. They passed me back and forth between two different forces, where I was, where the perpetrator was, for a good period of time. And when they did send an officer out to see me, he was as good as he could have been, but he was an older guy. I had to explain to him what Reddit were. I had to explain to him what a bunch of these acronyms were. And yeah, it was a very strange experience. And actually, now that I've been doing this for 6 years, I mean, a better experience than a lot of people I've spoken to have had. But still not good enough, and that really motivated me into, this is what I want to do. This is an area that needs massive change, and that's where I stepped away from the idea of doing kind of forensic genealogy or whatever I wanted to do in the criminal justice system, and really wanted to make a change from the outside. But I guess that's been unique, made me face unique challenges in itself, as not being a technical person and coming at this from a completely, like you say, a non-traditional angle, as many people do. Yeah, joining cyber as a non-technical person was definitely, a challenge to start with, but maybe not as hard as I thought it would be. And really kind of the industry was so supportive, and everybody was able to help me out with what sort of things should I be studying, what should I be looking out for. So it was difficult, but a lot easier than you'd expect it to be. And then I guess from kind of, again, a professional angle, it's that new and unexpected skills that, running a charity in particular, I've really had to learn over time. And starting out as a volunteer with the helpline and growing into kind of this head of operations role, picking up things that I never expected to be involved in. We're completely funded by the cybersecurity industry primarily, who kindly make donations to us, but also grants, and we've recently been funded by the Mayor of London. So that fundraising kind of skill set I've had to grow out of nowhere. There's always kind of unexpected things that you have to learn, which I love. And so it's not just kind of the same stuff day to day, which works out for me. I guess then coming on to like that more personal side of things, a couple of years ago, I found out that I have autism and waiting for an ADHD diagnosis. And that's been, I guess, interesting in kind of learning a bit more about myself, and how I kind of, perceive things, and the way that I work, especially as well. I'm very all over the place, but I love doing everything at once. So I think that burnout piece has been really interesting to me to learn about the diagnoses, because I'm constantly thinking about work. I am on the go 24/7. And I don't know the last time I had an actual day off. But that in itself, has been a really interesting experience to learn more about myself in the last few years, and the neurodivergence piece. And that's really helped me to understand how I work the way I do. It's been a challenge kind of coming to terms with, but actually that diagnosis has helped me really understand more about myself and be a bit more forgiving to myself, and try not to, go all in and burn myself out.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating insight. This is the first time you and I have had a conversation, and to hear about something that you went through like that, is actually quite profound. And I hope that law enforcement agencies, over the past few years, have become a bit more advanced, I guess when new types of cybercrime or digital stalking, the kind of evolution of things over the past few years, I do feel that probably in the past, agencies have probably not been as equipped as what they probably should be, whether that's just through maybe not enough young, diverse individuals coming through that are aware of what's going on. Like, I mean, you mentioned Reddit, multiple different things that relate to social media. And, we're obviously seeing a huge thing when it comes to like extortion online as well, with people being compromised via images and everything else. And, again, from your insight, do you see more of an advancement in that side, or do you feel that's what's given the cyber helpline, a kind of position in that, to be as like a kind of, maybe, I don't know, someone who just gets subbed off the bench and comes on the park, or is it a case of you're now seeing yourself as a kind of equal partner in that? Like, I'm interested to understand, do you share intelligence? Do you work together? I think people would really like to understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was reading something the other day, an article that was around kind of how different countries treat cybercrime, and it was talking about how in the UK, one of the way that kind of the initiative has worked for cyber is that, okay, as a country, we equip all of the people with the knowledge that they should know for how to stay safe online. So when something does happen, that onus is kind of on them. And I thought that was really interesting perspective, and it definitely rings true to me of, when people have reported to the police, the advice is often just block them, factory reset your device. It's advice that's being given rather than action taken against the perpetrator. And that in itself, I think, causes problems, because we think that as cybercrime advances, and it makes up over 50% of crimes in the UK now, and that's just the ones that are reported. How are we actually kind of, prosecuting, treating victims, and why are kind of they being held responsible for what's happening to them? And actually, the reality is that the advice that we're giving to people is oftentimes, well, not us, but as a society, is often dangerous. If you look at blocking someone, for example, I mean, it's something that's common sense. You wouldn't think about it. But if you're being stalked and you block that person, what is their next step going to take? Stalking by its nature is obsessive, it's repetitive. There's going to be another route that they're going to try and turn down, which oftentimes will be a physical route, and increased intensity, increased danger for the individual, not to mention potential loss of intelligence. So it's things like that I think have been really interesting for us to learn, especially as a charity that is full of cybersecurity people. We're having to kind of learn these bits and pieces from other organisations, stalking charities, domestic abuse charities, to make sure that the advice we're giving is safe. But equally, they're learning from us in the technical advice that we give. How do you gather evidence? How do you secure accounts and devices when it's safe to do so? So I think that was our first initial kind of partnership, was with these other organisations and charities. And the kind of, reasoning for that is no one can be an expert in everything. And we would never claim to be experts in, the physical side of things or the legal advice as such, but equally, they just sometimes need somebody to talk to about the tech stuff. And the reason I say that is because it's the same with the police. You're going to report a crime to them, a cybercrime, and you're probably speaking to an officer who is also dealing with burglary, domestic abuse, homicide, drug crimes, anything and everything. And I think at the moment, it's really interesting how we kind of expect officers to be an expert in all of these general things, without often really the appropriate training to be dealing with it. And so the advice that they're giving are assumptions, things that they've heard others say. It's not necessarily that there's kind of going to be an investigation that takes place. In fact, a lot of the time, the cases aren't even logged from what we're hearing. I think things have advanced, and I think that there's a long way to go still. But just since we've kind of come in, we've noticed that officers are reaching out to us more directly for advice, rather than us approaching them and saying, hey, like, you've forgotten about this case, what's going on? And now it's kind of the officers seem to be a lot more proactive in asking for that advice, which is really great to see. but also just policing as a whole. We're seeing a lot more initiatives in training officers, and getting those standards up to date of what advice should you be giving somebody, how do you ensure the integrity of evidence. It's taken a long time to get there, and there's still a really long way to go. And I think until we have specialized kind of cyber officers that are the point of contact at the beginning of every case, we're probably never going to get there entirely. Just because, that's the nature of it. No one could be an expert in everything. And that's where we really kind of step in and try and be that voice, not only for victims themselves, but for officers to just come to us and say, what's an IP address? There's no shame in asking those sorts of questions.
And do you find much of a difference between the UK and US? Because obviously, you've given a great insight there for the UK, and just for our audience reference, Cyber Helpline operates in the US as well. So I'm interested just to kind of get an insight from a US point of view as well.
Yeah, that's been really interesting. So I started the Cyber Helpline in the US a couple of years ago now. And it's been very similar in many ways. I mean, we've had the same, outpour of love from the cybersecurity community. We're getting applications for volunteers to join us every day. From a policing perspective, I think it's slightly different. I mean, just the way that law enforcement works in the US, it's mind-boggling in its own. The way that laws vary from state to state, like intimate image abuse, for example, is a crime in most states, but there's a few where it's not. So we really have to adapt to how do we ask these questions and make sure we're giving someone the right information. But I think policing's been, in general, really responsive to us. In the UK, I think at first we kind of struggled. I mean, we were these new guys who had turned up and were like, we're gonna, stop the cyber criminals, and, had really kind of optimistic attitude to where we could go with this. And we're doing this all for free. So I think there was a big suspicion around, well, why are these guys doing this? And it took a while for us to kind of build that trust, and rightly so. But now that we've got a great relationship with police in the UK for, a number of forces. In the US, whether it's because we've been established longer or just because of that culture, we've noticed that officers do seem to be a lot more responsive to us. They're far more willing to admit, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I'd rather hear that than hear somebody trying to, I've had cases of officers telling me that they've geolocated someone through, an IP address, and fun stuff like that. And it's like, okay, let's go back to step one. Whereas in the US, they're just willing to come forward and say, hey, I've got this case, I really don't know what to do. Can you help me? And I think that culture is really nice to have.
It's amazing to have that, because they're receptive and there's absolutely no shame. Listen, as you said, no one's an expert. Everyone struggles with it, whether it's your mum, dad, neighbor, gran, or someone in a company. There's some cases I've heard through the years that have just been like either super complex, like taking over mass amounts of like finance, or completely, I don't know, like a ransomware attack, right through to someone being tricked because they signed up to something on a website, and then before you know it, they're involved in a large scale fraud scam or whatever it may be. So I think, if I'm thinking in my head and I'm like, 10 years from now, I think it would be good if multiple law enforcement agencies collaborated more when they're going through the academies or training, they were getting this cyber education. And not just that, I think governments across obviously UK and US would just simply put adverts on mainstream TV to say, hey, beware of this scam, beware of this fraud. Or if there was like a national alert, so let's say there was an extortion gang running out of a country or whatever it may be, if GCHQ or someone shared that intelligence in mainstream media, then people might be aware of it. I'm not saying everyone's going to be able to understand it at a level that maybe you and I might, but I think that kind of general awareness, or breaking it down in a language where people could go, did you see that advert the other night? Oh, there's some hacking group called Fancy Bear, they're doing this, or whatever name they give them. But so I mean, I guess, where do you see things going in the next few years, if you could predict?
It's so hard to say. I think that, from what you've said about those announcements, we got really close to that, where There was a sextortion kind of announcement that was sent out to schools across the UK to say, this is a thing, talk to your students about it. And that was great because not only did it hit schools, but it brought awareness to media as well. So we were invited to a bunch of radio interviews. It was on, the national news, and really kind of brought awareness not only to those students and teachers, but parents and everybody really. And I think that's same as you. I'd love to see that. We see people all the time sharing these really scary stories about cyber and Pegasus and all this stuff that is very unlikely to happen to the general kind of person. And it really instills fear though in people that is something that's going to happen to them. But whilst we're kind of creating all of these stories and putting them out there and saying you need to be aware of this massive threat, that's not going to happen to general public, why aren't we kind of doing the same with the stuff that is going to happen and trying to encourage engagement with that instead? The reality is when you talk to people about it, they generally are interested in it. And it's one of those things where sometimes when you do see stuff posted, it's like, well, it would never happen to me. It would, but we're not always sharing the stories that show that it could happen to anybody. And it really could. I mean, cyber criminals aren't necessarily technical. They're often experts at marketing. And all it takes is wrong place, wrong time, and it really could happen to anybody. And I think we need to try and get people out of that mindset. I think where I'd like to see us go into the next 10 years as well is to take that kind of blame away from the victim. Obviously, I think that there's been massive improvements in that area, but I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. Sometimes these stories that we are sharing, and they're published in the media, they're all portraying the victim as a vulnerable person, which isn't necessarily the case. And even if they were, kind of, so what, this really could happen to anybody. So I think taking that blame away from the victim and putting the onus on the perpetrator, social media platforms, ISPs, the people that really need to be putting actions in place is where I'd want to see us go. So, for example, making a social media account, why isn't it that you create an account and the first thing that pops up is, do you want to turn two-factor authentication on? These settings should be offered to us by default rather than having to dig into your settings and find them there. So I think that, it's great these settings are available to people and some platforms are offering them regularly to people. But if we can have those safe settings on by default, I think that would change the game.
It's funny you mention that because the reason they don't is because of user experience, right? Everyone has this massive thing, whether it's people that are in the background that work for these social media platforms or any kind of app that you're using. There's always a product manager or there's always someone on that product side that's like, oh, but the user experience might be impacted. Literally for the sake of safety, it takes like a few seconds to turn these things on. It takes a few seconds to write a blurb on, this is why it's important, because most people actually use the same email and same password for multiple services. So then they become a victim of things like credential stuffing attacks and multiple other things. But I think a lot of these companies, maybe they don't really, they're maybe scared that they're going to maybe retract people. Or, like if we apply MFA by default, we won't get 10 million signups. It's like, it's ridiculous.
Exactly. And I think it's really interesting in itself because then you look at what happens when your account is hacked. You're probably not going to get it back. And the response from social media companies, you can't speak to a human, but if you can't speak to a human, why isn't there work being done in the background on these automated responses? And a lot of the work we do, unfortunately, with hacked accounts is setting expectations that actually you're probably not going to get it back. And if you do, it's probably going to take you a few years. 9 out of 10 times we're like, do you want us to help you set up a new account? And they're like, no, not really. I'm kind of over it now. I don't want to use this service again. So it's kind of, coming from a user experience angle, it's interesting how kind of that kind of ends at the point where somebody really is victimized by something. And, you know, I think that's something that with the online safety bill, there's going to be things enforced in the near future that hold social media platforms more to account. But I think there are standards really that we need to kind of develop as minimum best practice for service providers as a whole.
I think so. And it even goes wider where you have big tech, maybe perhaps the lobby, so certain actions aren't held against them. You know, you look at Zuckerberg quite recently was, pulling a naivety card. You shouldn't be able to sign up to an app, then it's illicit material.
Yeah.
It's the first thing the algorithm targets you on.
Yeah.
And then you find out that a lot of this stuff is like 50% of their revenue generated on these big tech platforms is because of illicit content.
Yes.
It's like everyone, I guess, needs to work together. Can I take that angle away? Even all the basics we've mentioned, like MFA, then right through to the advanced stuff where you certainly don't want a child, signing up to something and then they're an easy victim.
Yeah.
Because someone's able to scrape the platform or look at certain accounts and say, well, there's a 10-year-old that signed up to this platform, and then they're targeted. So hopefully, as you said, some of these bills and laws that come in can certainly help people and try and maybe kind of pivot away from that. But I guess we'll kind of need to wait and see. And then kind of talking about let's talk about some of the work that the helpline has done and some of the cases you've seen and helped with. So obviously, for confidentiality reasons, we can't mention specific people or companies. But again, I want to hear some of the horror stories, but also some of the success stories, because this is quite important. And then we'll obviously move into some advice, hints, and tips to help people over the festive period. So yeah, talk me through some of the horror stories if you can, and also some of the really good success stories. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think, the last 6 years, people come to me and say, have you ever seen anything like XYZ before? And I think I've seen it all at this point.
Yeah.
And whenever I say that, something never fails to surprise me. I mean, there's, always really interesting stuff happening. But I mean, when you look at what we're dealing with, it's really a majority of things, and only by a small number are these more kind of harassment, stalking, non-financial crimes, but that still have a real violent impact on the individual. And I think that the count is kind of like 60-40. So 40% are the financial crimes that we're dealing with. And I guess like the reason I mention that is because I think that cybercrime as a whole, we often think about as a financial crime. The impact on the individual is finances. But that's not necessarily true. Even when somebody's coming to us and, they've lost their life savings, they've lost tens of thousands of pounds, millions, whatever it might be, coming to us and saying, I've experienced this crime, but the real impact on me isn't that I've lost the money. I just feel stupid. My mental health is affected, my friends and family, my relationship with them is impacted. And I don't care if I get the money back at this point, but I just want to, feel like I have a safe space to talk about it. And it's been really interesting to see that. I think that when we talk about cybercrime and there's government and policing figures that come out, it's always about the funds that are lost. And actually, forget about that for a second. 70 to 80% of people who experienced any form of cybercrime or online harm feel that their physical safety is impacted as a result. Be that they feel that somebody else is a danger to them, and that could be the perpetrator themselves. It could be friends and family, particularly honor-based violence cases, and it could be that they feel that they're a risk to themselves. And that is a massive number that are saying that as a result of what's happened, I feel like I'm in physical danger. And I mean, some of the cases we've dealt with, like I said, I can't go into specifics on them, but there's a really kind of common theme around that sense of safety, that sense of mental health, but also just a lack of feeling heard, whether that be by law enforcement, other agencies involved, friends and family. And sometimes that's all somebody wants, is just to phone us up, speak to somebody that understands the tech. And obviously we can talk them through the steps that they can take, but that's a big first step for somebody, to just speak to somebody that's like, yeah, I get it, I've heard it before, and that's a massive barrier to somebody. I think some of the cases that have stood out to me the most over the years have been some of those kind of stalking and harassment cases. I think stalking is really interesting because it encompasses such a variety of different crimes into, you know, one thing. And that makes it really difficult because I've had cases where they've reported to the police and, you know, it's like, well, it's an ex-partner and there's not a lot we can do. This is a civil matter. Or it does get prosecuted, but it's not under the stalking and harassment crimes. It's under, you know, other crimes and financial abuse and things like that. So we're not kind of seeing the full picture of things. But we've seen everything from, you know, smart home technologies being used, especially when we have cost of living crisis and even in summer, you know, the heating being turned up to full remotely just to make somebody uncomfortable or have to pay more for their heating than they'd want to. There was a few cases that we saw this happening where, you know, the perpetrator would have access to the Ring doorbell, so they'd see when a person left the house, and as soon as they did, they would turn all their electronics on so that they wouldn't notice that, you know, the kettle's turned on, the heating's turned up, whatever it might be. You know, and I think as somebody experiencing stalking, you start to kind of worry, how is the technology being used? You know something's not right, but you're not necessarily sure what it is and how it's happening. You know, somebody knows information about me they shouldn't. Is that because they've got spyware on my device? Is it because they've got bugs in my home? What could they possibly be using? And when you Google it, like you say, it's easy to Google stuff and try and find that advice. But if people are trusting that at face value, the first thing that comes up is probably going to be that you've got some form of spyware on your device. So that's what people are coming to us and saying, you know, I've got spyware on my phone. It's like, okay, let's take a step back. Why do you think that in the first place? And I think we've probably seen 3 or 4 cases of spyware in the 6-7 years I've been here. The majority of times it's that the Apple ID or the Google account's been hacked, or they have access, if it's an ex-partner, they might have set up their accounts for them, so they already have access to them. They might have set up devices in the smart home, so they have access to the Amazon Echo, things like that. It's very basic things that's being used, or, you know, basic to us. But when you think about how is a perpetrator going to operate, it's the path of least resistance, right? So why are you going to do all of this technical stuff when there's an easier way to do it? There's a way that you maybe have already have access to devices. It might be, you know, perceived as a less kind of criminal activity to hack an account rather than use spyware. So I think that that's probably one of the hardest parts of our cases, but also the most interesting part is that people come to us with a perceived notion of what's happening, and 9 out of 10 times it's something completely different. But certainly kind of the use of hacked accounts is something we're always seeing as a major conduit to stalking behaviours. And generally, kind of most of our cases in general will have a hacked account somewhere. Yeah, and smart home technologies as well. There's no limit to what kind of we've seen them being used for in these cases.
Yeah, it's interesting insight, and you know, again, it may seem fairly obvious to us, but until you're in a situation, like one of the things you touched upon there was like the separation or partner separation. Not everyone's gonna go change their bank account details or multiple different things that they have shared login accounts. And then again, if that situation ends up in a kind of, I don't know, maybe abusive scenario, then that can be used to leverage someone or be used to effectively make things very difficult for them. And you know, obviously we'll touch upon hints and tips and everything else shortly in a minute. But in terms of the success stories of the helpline, you know, maybe give me a couple of them because, you know, I'd heard of the helpline previously speaking to Bruce, but it wasn't until I spoke with Bruce. And FYI was actually one of my favourite episodes of the season so far. And, you know, the work that the individuals do in the organisation is amazing. Without it, I think there would be, I don't know, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people in a situation where they probably can't get themselves out of. So I'm interested to know, you know, talk me through a couple of those success stories where you've been able to you know.
Yeah, I'm like, there's so many, and I'm racking my brains for what I can talk about, but there's one that I think always comes to mind. And whenever I tell this story to people, it's, you know, such a strange one where this woman had contacted us and said that, you know, something just didn't feel right with her accounts and devices. She wasn't sure what it was, but she'd recently left her partner. And you know, speaking to her, very kind of similar situation to what we spoke about. He was the IT controller in the relationship, so he'd kind of asserted himself as, you know, I know everything about technology. Why don't you let me set this up for you and that up for you? And he just did it all. And after kind of he'd left, she'd purchased a new car, and she brought this up in passing to us and was just like, yeah, this really weird thing keeps happening where I'm driving down the road, you know, to work or wherever it may be, and I keep hearing this meow. So I pull over to the side of the road, I look under the bonnet, and I'm looking for a cat or whatever it is, and she can't find it. And this happened to her, you know, multiple times. I think the first journey she got out of her car 5 or 6 times looking for this cat, couldn't find it. And this went on for days. And she just mentioned it because she was like, this is really weird. Come to find out, because we were like, okay, let's actually look into this because maybe something's being used here. So the ex-partner had got broken into her car. And he had set the sat nav to meow when she passed certain destinations.
Yeah.
And it's just weird things like that that I think, you know, to anybody would feel like, why does that matter? But it's just little things that, you know, okay, I'm here, I'm watching you, I'm whatever
It's
it might be.
it's a mechanism of control, and it
Yeah,
is a form of like psychological warfare, especially when it comes to a
exactly.
relationship where someone is unhappy that there's been a separation. I know that that's extreme language I'm using, like psychological warfare, but it is when it comes to abusive relationships and, as you said, control over another person. But sorry, please
No,
continue.
totally. And yeah, it's so right, because I think to anybody else it kind of feels like, well, you know, why does that matter? But it was a massive thing for her, and there were other things going on. Looking at her devices, we managed to find unauthorized kind of access to accounts, and he
Mm.
did end up being prosecuted based on the evidence that we were able to help her collect. And that was, you know, a big case. I think that took us around a year. We had 6 different people kind of working on different aspects of it. But the cat always kind of sticks with me as just people will do anything. Um, and, you know, there's been so many different cases that have been very similar. So it kind of, whilst it went to the extreme in terms of the amount of activity that was going on, it really kind of is a kind of typical case for us in many ways, where we will have, you know, a long time that we'll be working on it and hopefully will eventually lead to prosecution. And very similarly, we had a kind of intimate image abuse case where someone had contacted us at kind of 4 in the morning. And I think this really shows the beauty of us having volunteers. We've got, you know, SOC analysts who work shifts, so they'll be on at ridiculous times. And when you're a victim of a cybercrime, you want help there and then. So when she contacted us, one of our volunteers was online and kind of immediately reached out. And it turned out kind of she'd been sent intimate pictures of herself, and she just wasn't sure who had sent them, because they were really old pictures before she'd even met her partner. Or I think what she said to us, they were ones she had kind of taken but never ended up sending. Um, and, you know, she wasn't going to report to the police. She was terrified of kind of, what are they going to say? What's my partner going to say? And it was just, she just wanted somebody to kind of feel that out with, have that conversation with, and get this off her chest so that she could come to a decision on her own, but she needed to say it out loud. And she contacted the police. They came round and essentially kind of managed to track down the guy, which the images were sent on Snapchat. So it's really rare, actually, that we do find that we get results from that. But they did manage to obtain an IP address, went to the ISP and found out who the guy was. And it turned out it was her husband's best friend.
Wow.
And he'd managed to hack into her Snapchat account, download the pictures, and was just sending them to her. It turned out that he had a crush on her, but he was using this intimidation technique to, you know, try and threaten her essentially.
Yeah.
So, an arrest ended up being made there, but I think the kind of input that we had in that was little, but I think really kind of, again, stands out to me is just, having somebody to talk to and feel things through with. There are so many that I would love to talk about that I can't, but those are a couple that I know I can, and they're kind of public stories that can be found online. And yeah, I think just really shows kind of the impact of what we do for a couple of different levels. A, that kind of police investigation, but B, just having someone to talk to. And one of the things that the lady in the last case said to us was, if I didn't have someone to speak to at that time, I probably wouldn't have called the police, because it was all happening right then and there. And maybe a few hours later, I would have said, forget about it. And things might have escalated from there. But as it happened, this guy was caught within a few days of this starting.
Good. And I think a lot of people probably underestimate these types of crimes because we've seen it reportedly where, people of different ages that have kind of effectively taken their own life as a result of being blackmailed. And, there was a well-known extortion gang in Nigeria. They were posting videos of themselves bragging about it and everything else. And, obviously, you know, people just get themselves in a situation for whatever reason it may be. But, I think when things are kind of put in the public domain, or you're putting things on social, or you think things are safe on your phone, then, ultimately you open yourself up to being compromised. But we shouldn't need to live in a world like that where people are obviously trying to take advantage. But,
Okay.
Thankfully, again, there's people like yourselves who are on call effectively, and helping people with, around the clock, and trying to obviously try and avert that type of escalation, because it's quite easily done where someone feels they have no help, the entire world is imploding, and they've got nowhere else to turn to. But yeah, so moving on to the kind of last segment then of the episode, and I'm interested if you have any items of advice for people. We've touched upon smart devices. We've touched upon things that you put in the public domain. Is there any hints and tips and advice you would give for people to keep themselves and their families safe online? This advice can be applied throughout the entire duration of your life, but I think obviously, we've got, this is a Christmas episode, even though it's months in advance. But, is there any kind of advice you would give to people for, various different things like Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, posting things
Sure.
online? Yeah.
I think one of the biggest things I like to talk about, and there's so much great advice on there about how you can secure your accounts and devices. There's great resources for that. But I think one of the big topics right now is around young people and how do we keep them safe online. And I think that, it's so difficult to be able to trust a young person online, especially when it's your kid. You want to know what they're up to. You want to know what they're doing. You've heard so many horror stories about what's happened. And I think that there's one of the problems right now is this kind of perception of surveillance as a form of love. And this is something I really struggle kind of to come to terms with is, there's parental tracking apps, there's, parents that are asking to check their kid's phone every week, and it is for a very good reason. And I think what we need to think about is consent in that case. Like, has the young person consented to this? Have we made sure that, they're trusting it? Because what we see as people get older, and this is what we've kind of seen at the helpline, is because we're kind of conditioning young people to believe it's okay if something like my parents are tracking my location, like that's normal. It's okay if they've got a tracking device on or they've given me an AirTag to wear to school, that kind of thing. What's then going to happen in future relationships, and will they perceive that as normal if a partner starts trying to do that to them? And of course, in some relationships, yeah, that might be normal. That might be something that both partners consent to. And I think that we need to have the same kind of thought process for when we're working with young people, speaking to your children about why you're doing this. Would they feel comfortable doing it? What restrictions are you going to put in place if they don't? But I think that surveillance is, a really tricky one. And I think that these things are being done for good reason. But how do we make sure we're not kind of creating a future generation that start believing these kind of essentially kind of future coercive controlling behaviors are normal? Obviously, that's not what's necessarily happening to them right now, but in time, how will they perceive kind of coercive controlling behaviors, and will they see that as a normal thing? So I know that's kind of not the traditional cybersecurity kind of advice, but I think is a really important thing to bring up. Looking at cybersecurity as kind of a whole generally, I think it's checking settings is such a big thing. It's such a everyone talks about two-factor authentication and all of these specific areas, having different passwords for different things, password managers. I think the biggest thing is, as I said earlier, most providers aren't putting safe settings on by default. You've got your default settings, you sign into your account, you're done. One of the biggest things I advise anybody, is once you make a new account, go into your settings, see what's there, see what it all does, and turn on anything that you want turned on. It's not necessarily just thinking, okay, I'm going to turn two-factor authentication on all of my accounts. That's great, but what else is there in terms of your privacy settings? What are you sharing with who? Is there a way that you can set up a trusted contact? So if you ever lose access to your account, there's somebody that can get it back for you. Little things like that aren't turned on by default, and you might need to do a bit of digging to find, but each provider is totally different. So it often takes 5 minutes, press the settings button and scroll through and see what's there, and turn on the stuff that is good. Sometimes most providers will explain what it does. Sometimes you might have to do a bit of a Google search for every setting. But yeah, I think that's the main thing is, you can Google advice all you want, and there's some great stuff out there, but nothing beats just scrolling through your settings for a bit and seeing what you have control over. And I think that's a really great opportunity to educate yourself on the different tools that are available as well.
Some sage advice there, absolutely excellent. And one of the items you touched upon is, like, obviously with a younger generation and not creating those kind of behaviors later on in life. It's finding a balance, but it's kind of back to the old stranger danger.
Yeah.
Why do you implement these things? And things are obviously becoming more and more unsafe. We've obviously seen that recently in the UK, and it's like, again, it's so easy for people to get themselves into an app and start talking to your children, or maybe online gaming, and then those things obviously escalate into other things. But you touched upon things like going through your settings, and I think sometimes people are a bit scared to kind of do these things. It's amazing if you just watch a YouTube video, where you can see someone that can break it down in like 30 seconds to show you how to change the default password, and then that helps mitigate multiple other possible issues. And
Sure.
yeah, absolutely. So we'll conclude today then, Charlotte. Again, thank you so much for your insight and your stories with the Cyber Helpline, and obviously we'll plug you guys in the podcast. And again, anyone who's looking for advice, we'll put all that information. So whether you're in the US or the UK, and then it doesn't feel like a Christmas episode because obviously I'm not wearing a hat, and neither you. Yeah, I know. But I thought, when I reached out to you guys, that I wanted to do a specific special, because obviously fraud tends to heighten at these periods of the year, and we want to avoid that. We want to avoid scams, and we want to try and educate people and take them on that journey. So if anyone wants any help or advice, please reach out to the Cyber Helpline, and again, please like, share, subscribe, and then thanks again for your time, Charlotte. I appreciate it.
Having me.